She didn't come here to find a home, but merely a place to get through the harsh winter. For Clara, a widow with calloused hands and a heart that had been stitched back together too many times, cooking for a taciturn man and his 6 motherless daughters was simply a job. She would keep her distance, fulfill her duties, and then leave. But she never expected that in the very first week. The youngest daughter would cling to the hem of her apron, look up with clear eyes, and ask a question that would reshape her destiny forever. "Are you my mama now?" Clara didn't wait for the man to speak. She stepped down from the wagon the moment the reins were dropped, her canvas bag bumping gently against her knees. Her boots hit the dirt with a firmness that hadn't been in her spirit for years. It was the middle child, Eliza, who noticed her first. The girl peeked from behind a porch post, a smudge of blackberry on her chin and eyes too large for her small face. Clara lifted a hand in a quiet salute, but Eliza quickly ducked out of sight, as swift as a groundhog into its hole. A man's bootstep sounded behind the post as he rounded the corner. He was tall, too tall for the hat he wore, and broader than any man Clara had met in her 2 years of travel since George's death. She waited for him to speak, but he only nodded once, his eyes not on her, but on the bag she had placed at her feet. "My name is Clara Weaver," she said quickly. "Widowed 2 years this fall. I cook, I clean. I don't tolerate sass or laziness. You said 6 girls. I brought extra flour." His eyes flicked to her then, just a glance, but something registered. Recognition, perhaps, not of her face, but of the type of woman she was, worn at the edges, stitched back together too many times, and still upright. He held out a hand. "Matthew Langley," he said, his voice rough like bark stripped from pine. "The house is that way." He gestured toward a sprawling timber home behind the barn, a corner of its porch sagging slightly. Inside, the house bore the same wear as the man in the land. A table scarred with years of children's elbows, spoons, and lesson slates. 6 pairs of tiny boots arranged in a crooked line by the door. And in the air, the faint smell of burnt flour and soured milk. "I'll make supper," she said, without waiting to be asked. "Don't bother," came a sharp voice from the stairs. It was Bethany, the eldest, her arms crossed tight, her jaw more stubborn than her 10 years. "We're not hungry." Clara didn't answer. She set her bag down, rolled up her sleeves, and headed straight for the root cellar. By dusk, the scent of real food filled the house. A stew thick with herbs, bread rising in the heat of the stone hearth, and wild honey drizzled into tea, for the little ones who didn't ask for it, but drank every last drop. No one spoke during the meal. The man sat at the head of the table, his knife sliding through the crust of the bread in a measured rhythm. The girls glanced back and forth between him and Clara, as if unsure what invisible lines were still drawn. It was just as Clara wiped her hands and began to clear the dishes that had happened. A tug at her skirt. She looked down. The youngest, Addie, stood there, blinking up at her, her small fingers curled into the hem of Clara's apron. She had curls the color of butter left out too long, and a voice like the wind between shutters. "Are you my mama now?" The words silenced every scrape of a fork and clink of a spoon in the room. Clara's breath caught in her throat, too full of memory and ache to answer. Her gaze flicked to Matthew, but he had looked away. I just cook and clean, sweetheart," Clara whispered, nothing more. But Addie only nodded, as if she had heard something else entirely, then quietly went back to her seat without another word. That night, Clara lay in the small back room, her hands folded tight, trying not to remember the child she had buried before she ever saw her first birthday. The silence of the house creaked around her, but then, somewhere in the darkness, the floorboards shifted. A whisper of feet, then the softest knock against her door. "Ma'am," it was Eliza again. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and opened the door. The little girl stood there, a candle cupped in her small hands. "I heard a coyote," she murmured. "Can I just stay here for a bit?" Clara didn't speak. She stepped aside, and Eliza climbed into the little cot without another sound. She would wake later to find another child, then another, curled against her legs and sides. One by one, they had braved the creaks of the floor just to be near her. When the sun rose, Clara's bed was full, the room filled with the soft breaths of 6 little girls. Dot and Matthew noticed. He stood outside the room just past dawn, arms crossed, hat in hand, his eyes deep. Clara emerged, rubbing her eyes, trying not to show how deeply she had slept for the first time in years. "They all came to me," she said quietly. "I didn't ask them." "I know," he said after a pause. He didn't smile, but his gaze softened just slightly. "Enough." The days followed like a breathless wind. Clara didn't ask where their mother had gone, and none of the girls told her. Not even when she cleaned out a cupboard and found a single ribbon still faintly perfumed with lavender and smoke. Not even when she spotted Bethany sitting outside, her mother's old shoes in her lap, polishing them though they hadn't fit her since spring. But grief leaves traces, and a mother's absence is a space too wide to fill. Clara didn't try to fill it. She just made sure there was food on the table, stitches in every hem, and a warm hand brushing back hair from fevered foreheads when the night chills set in. And then, one by one, they changed. Even Bethany stopped glaring at her. Once, while walking past the pantry, Clara heard the girl mutter to herself, "She doesn't even smell like ashes." Whatever that meant, it settled like a stone in Clara's chest. The real shift came with the fence. A storm rolled through, tearing down half the post line. Matthew worked from sunup to fix it. Clara brought biscuits out and found him standing there, his shoulders sagging, his palms bleeding from the rope. "Let me," she said, grabbing the hammer before he could object. He didn't stop her. They worked in silence until the sky began to darken again, and that's when it happened. From the house, Addie's voice came, tiny and sharp, carried by the wind. "You fixed our fence. Can you fix Mama's heart too?" The hammer dropped from Clara's hand. Matthew froze, and the rain started to fall. He didn't turn around. Clara stood, motionless, her palms damp from work and rain, her breath held. She bent down, picked up the hammer, and offered it back to him. He didn't take it. "I'll get supper started," she said gently. Finally Matthew met her eyes, his own guarded but not hard. "I'll finish here," he said after a moment. The walk back to the house felt longer than it had the first night. The sky broke open before she reached the porch. By the time she stepped inside, she was soaked. The girls rushed around her, bringing towels, pulling her toward the hearth, each one talking over the other. It wasn't until she had dried her hair and set the kettle back on that she realized they had formed an unplanned circle around her. Bethany stood in the doorway, arms crossed again, but her voice had lost its edge. "You didn't even flinch when she said that." "I heard," Clara replied softly. "She says things like that sometimes," Bethany continued. "Mama stuff, it hurts." Clara nodded. "Yes, it does. Are you going to stay?" The question wasn't sharp, not even challenging. It was just tired, so much older than 10. Clara's answer came after a silence that wrapped around the room like a warm blanket. "I don't plan to leave." Bethany looked at her sisters, then back to Clara. "Good," she said. "We're tired of women who leave." The door creaked behind them as Matthew stepped inside, water streaming from his coat. His eyes swept the room, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, his shoulders didn't look so weighed down. That night, the storm howled louder, thunder cracking like a tree splitting down the middle. Lahi screamed from her loft bed, and Clara was already up the ladder before Matthew's feet hit the floorboards. "It's all right," she soothed, gathering the little girl against her chest. "It's just noise, just the sky stomping its boots." "Is the sky mad?" Lahi whimpered. "No, sweetheart, just loud." Loud doesn't mean angry. The other girls began to stir, and Clara lay down across the floorboards of the loft, letting the children gather around her like kittens to a warm stove. Their breathing slowed, the storm rolled past, and peace settled back into the wood. Matthew didn't return to his room. She heard his footsteps pause, then recede toward the porch. 3 days passed before he spoke to her with any real depth. They were in the barn, tending to an injured goat. Clara held the animal still while Matthew stitched its flank, his hand surprisingly gentle. "You've been around animals much?" he asked quietly. "I grew up on a farm." "Then you know how they get skittish when something's off." Clara nodded. "The girls, they're like that. After their mama passed, they didn't say a word for nearly 2 weeks. I didn't know what to do. Still don't." "You kept them fed. You stayed." "I stay because I don't know how to do anything else. That's more than most would." He tied the last stitch and stood. "The little one, the one who called you Mama the first day. She's barely 5. She was with her mother when she died. Found her curled up beside her in bed. Took me hours to get her to let go." They stood in silence after that. Matthew glanced toward the house. "I don't know what you're doing to them," he said, "but whatever it is, they're sleeping through the night again." "I'm not doing anything," Clara replied. "Just showing up." "Then maybe that's what they needed all along." That Sunday, they walked to church. Clara hadn't stepped inside a church since her husband's funeral, and her knees buckled, but she forced herself forward. The sermon was on restoration, about how broken things could be mended. When she looked over, she saw Bethany had slipped her hand into Addie's. After the service, Addie came running, pressing a dove feather into her hand. "To keep your heart soft," Addie said. "I just think it's a little sad, but better now." Matthew witnessed it all. The next morning, on Clara's windowsill sat 2 biscuits, shaped like hearts. They were lumpy, burnt at the edges, but perfect. The house began to change. Not suddenly, but in the small things. Matthew started leaving his tools where she could reach them. One morning, he poured her coffee first, without a word. It was stronger than she liked, but she drank it. The next morning, it was weaker. That small courtesy was a sentence in a book they had both forgotten how to read. Soon, the girls began calling her Mama when they forgot. At first, it was accidental. "Mama. I mean, Miss Clara, can I have more?" Each time, Clara would just offer a small smile. She stopped correcting them. Matthew never said a word. The first test came in the form of a knock. A stranger stood on the porch, looking her over for too long. When Matthew came out behind her, silent and wide-shouldered, the man laughed nervously. "Heard there was a widow cooking for a whole passel of girls and a lone man," he said. Matthew stepped onto the porch, slow as molasses but 10 times as dangerous. "You heard wrong," he said. "She ain't a widow cooking. She's family." The man backed off like smoke and wind and didn't come near again. Then came the second test, sickness. Little Rosie woke shivering, her breath wheezing. Clara barked orders like a general born in a storm. Boil water, fetch willow bark, peep the others back. Matthew rode into town in a fury, returning with the doctor and medicine. He paced like a madman outside the door while Clara sat on the bed with Rosie in her arms, whispering prayers between cool cloths and shivering sighs. It took 4 days, but the fever broke. When Rosie finally opened her eyes and asked for a biscuit, Clara cried into the sheets and didn't bother pretending she hadn't. That night, the girls wrapped around her like roots to a tree. And that was the first night Matthew said the word out loud. "Mama," he said, standing in the doorway. "She called you Mama just now." Clara nodded. "She did." Matthew looked at her, truly looked at her, the weariness and sorrow in his face slowly giving way to something softer. "You all right with that?" Clara blinked through her tears. "More than all right." He left the doorway, but in the morning, There was a small bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen table, picked fresh and bound with string. No one confessed to placing them there. The world after Rosie's fever was different. The walls of the house seemed to breathe easier, and laughter returned without being coaxed. Clara started singing again. She hadn't noticed she'd stopped, but one morning, she found herself humming. As she peeled potatoes, and soon Addie had picked up the tune, twirling in slow circles in the doorway. The church was no longer just a place of prayer. It was a place where they belonged. And prayer found its way home. One evening, as the stew was still steaming, Matthew bowed his head and spoke slowly. "Thank you, Lord, for this meal, and for the hands that made it. For Clara, who brings light to this table, and steadies what was once so close to breaking." No. Girl lifted her head, but Clara's heart did. That night, she knelt beside her bed and cried, not from sorrow, not quite from joy, but from the release of something clenched inside her for years. She had come to cook, but God had placed her in the middle of a family desperate to be whole again. But the past is not let go easily. A letter arrived, sealed with a hurried postmark. The script was too neat, the ink too fresh. It was from Raymond, her late husband's brother, the one who had written only once since the funeral and had never shown up. He said he was moving west. Heard she was working for a widower with 6 children, and that maybe it was time they spoke again. He signed it, Ray, with no love, no apology. She folded the letter slowly, quietly, and put it in her apron pocket. It sat there like a stone, growing heavier each night. Of course, Matthew noticed. He waited until the girls were asleep, until the lamp on the porch flickered low. "You seem far away," he said. Clara didn't lie. "There was a letter from someone I used to think would bury me right next to my husband. Now he writes as if I were a stranger who moved away." Matthew stirred the last of his coffee. "You planning to go see him?" "I don't know. You'd tell me if you were. I'm telling you now." Silence settled. Then he said softly, "You've already built something here. The girls love you." Clara looked out at the dark field. "I didn't come here looking for love. And I didn't hire you for it," Matthew said. "But there it is." Clara's breath caught. When their eyes met in the hush of the quiet porch, the air between them felt as thin as paper and 10 times more fragile. The letter remained unanswered. Clara already had her answer. One night, when the moon was high, he stood outside her door. He didn't knock, just breathed in long and slow, and whispered, "Clara." She opened the door, already dressed, her hair braided. "I thought maybe you'd come." He looked down at her hands, then back at her face. "I have something I need to say." He took her hands in his. "I lost my wife, but I didn't lose my heart." "Neither did I. I thought love ended with death." "I thought so too." He stepped closer. "I was wrong." He held out a ring, not new, old and worn, probably his mother's. Not to replace anyone, but to choose someone. Clara stared at it, then at him, then whispered, "Yes." He placed the ring on her finger as if it had always belonged there. Their wedding was simple, held under the blooming crab apple tree behind the house, its white petals falling like a quiet blessing. The 6 girls wore matching blue dresses Clara had stitched from old curtains. Bethany cried so hard, Clara had to hold her hand through the whole ceremony. Matthew kissed each girl on the forehead before he finally turned to Clara, his eyes clearer than she had ever seen them. "I promise," he said, "to keep this house steady, and to keep you always safe." "And I promise," Clara replied, not trying to hold back her tears, "to love these girls as my own, and to love you as if I'd been waiting my whole life." But just 2 days after the wedding, a knock came at the door, hard and businesslike. Sheriff Denham stood there, hat in hand, a grave look on his face. "Sorry to interrupt your new start, Matthew, but you've been named in a property dispute." Matthew frowned. "Your late wife's cousin, Martin. He's claiming the land was deeded improperly. He says your wife inherited it, not you. Now he's saying it should have passed to her kin. Matthew went still. That land had been his since he was 17. The girls had clustered in the doorway, listening. Clara moved quickly, ushering them away, but Hannah stayed. They're not going. To take our house, she said, her voice flat. Clara didn't answer. Not yet, she thought. The peace they had just sewn together was now threatened. The following weeks unraveled the quiet peace they had just stitched together. Matthew made frequent trips to town, speaking to a lawyer, gathering deeds. His absence was a hole in the house, and the girls' silence grew heavier. Clara filled the gap as best she could, but there was a tension in the walls, a fear she could feel in every whisper the children shared under their quilts. If they take the land, she wondered, where do we go? Then one night, while searching through a drawer for birth certificates, anything to strengthen their claim, Matthew found something else. Something forgotten. An unopened letter. He brought it to Clara in the kitchen. It's from Ruth, he said, his voice rough, from a year before she passed. Clara took it gently, opened the envelope, and read aloud. Her voice was steady, but every word carried weight. Dearest Matthew, if you are reading this, I have probably gone. I've tried not to worry you, but I want things in order. That land. Your land was always yours. I know what it meant to you. I never wanted anyone else laying a hand on it. I don't trust my cousin Martin. I always had a feeling he'd come sniffing around. I want you to have peace, for the girls to grow up where they belong. And maybe someday you won't be alone out there. I hope someone good finds you, someone kind, someone who sees you for the man you are. Love, Ruth. The letter was dated, signed, and witnessed by a neighbor. Clara clutched it to her chest. This. This saves everything, and it did. The lawyer confirmed it. The legal challenge collapsed within days, and Martin left town, grumbling threats no one paid any mind to. The house remained theirs. The fields remained theirs. Their future settled once again beneath their feet, firm as the ground, after a long storm. But something had changed in Clara. Seeing how quickly everything could be threatened had stirred something deep inside her. She began keeping a small ledger, noting every dollar spent, every quart of jam sold. Matthew noticed, of course. You think we'll need to fight again? He asked. I think I want to be ready. He didn't argue. He simply took her hand and said, then I'll build you a better pantry. One morning, another letter arrived. This time, it was for Clara. She recognized the handwriting from a time she thought long buried. It was from her first husband's sister. The letter was brief, but one sentence, written in careful ink, wouldn't leave her thoughts for days. He never stopped regretting what he did to you. I thought you should know. She handed the letter to Matthew. He read it silently, then gave it back. You all right? He asked. I'm better than all right, she said. I just didn't expect the door to close so softly. Matthew nodded. You deserve soft doors, life went on. Spring yielded to summer. One afternoon, Clara sat on the porch with a letter in her lap. It was from her own sister, Ruth, in Chicago. She wanted Clara to visit. The thought of leaving, even for a week, felt impossible. That night, she told Matthew. He didn't flinch. Didn't ask her not to go. He just said, we'll miss you something terrible. I haven't said yes yet, but I think you will. Matthew nodded. Then I'll get the girls started on painting you a picture to take with you. 2 weeks later, Clara boarded a train. The girls cried at the station, and Matthew held Rosie as if afraid she'd blow away. The journey was long and bumpy. The city was louder than she remembered. Her sister's house smelled of polished wood and lilac. She made cornbread for her nephews, but her heart wasn't there. On the third night, she walked alone, seeing the old bakery where she and her first husband had once sat, it had changed. The windows were different. The smell was gone. She didn't cry. She just turned back and looked up at the stars overhead, soft and foreign like a different sky. The next morning, she packed early. "My family's waiting back home." She just smiled and told Ruth. The girls had made a banner, "Welcome home, Mama," written in paint and ribbons, hung between two trees. Matthew stood beneath it, hat in hand, as if he couldn't believe she had really come back. "I brought cookies," Clara said, holding up the tin. "And I brought tears," he said, pulling her into his arms. That night when the girls were asleep, Clara sat beside him on the porch. "Did you ever think we'd get this far?" Matthew didn't answer for a long moment. Then he said, "Every day I thought it'd fall apart." She smiled. "It didn't." "No," he replied. "It didn't." Autumn folded itself gently into winter, and cold winters full of laughter melted into busy summers. The house that had once echoed with ache now breathed with the noise of living, bare feet on floorboards, squeals through the fields, and soft voices calling for supper as the sky turned pink at dusk. The girls grew like saplings reaching for the sun. Bethany wrote poems in an old leather journal. Hannah sketched the birds of the region with a saint's patience. Rosie made the whole house laugh with her impression of the rooster, and the younger girls followed their sisters like a line of ducklings. They all called Clara Mama, as if they had never known another word. She never corrected them, not once. Not even when Bethany turned 18 and whispered, "You saved us." Not even when Hannah asked, "Do you think my real mother would be proud of me?" Clara just held her close and said, "Yes, because she would. Be, and because you are a wonderful girl." One autumn evening many years later, after the girls had all found their own paths, Clara and Matthew sat beside the fire. He poured them both mugs of hot cider, and they watched the flames curl and spit. "You think we'll be okay?" she asked, not because she doubted, but because sometimes it helped to hear it again. Matthew reached over, taking her hand, their fingers lacing together as familiar as breathing. "I know we will." There was no lightning bolt, no grand revelation. Just warmth, a steady warmth and peace. A few years after that, a visitor stopped by. An old friend of the sheriff, asking if a niece could board somewhere. The girl was new to town, nervous, orphaned, and looking for work. She had no kin. Clara didn't hesitate for a second. "We've always got room for one more," she said, her eyes full of something deeper than kindness. Something like memory. The girl's name was Elsie. She cried the first night she stayed, and the second night too. But by the third night, Rosie had told her a joke. Bethany had shared a scarf, and Matthew had built her a small desk by the window. Clara tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "You're home now." And she meant it. The house grew again. The love grew again. And long after, when Clara's hair had turned to silver and the porch creaked under different feet, a little plaque was nailed above the door. It read, "Where hearts are mended and families begin again." And that is exactly what it had always been.